Welcome to the show Brain Rot, What Our Screens Are Doing to Our Minds, a special series from the New Books Network. Here are your hosts, Dr. Karen Messina and Dr. Harry Gill.
Hello, I'm Dr. Karen Messina with Dr. Harry Gill, and we're going to talk about our third episode of Brain Rot, What Screens Are Doing to Our Minds. Dr. Gill is a well-known psychiatrist with a PhD in neuroscience, and I'm a psychologist and psychoanalyst and author, and I'm the host of the New Books Network podcasts. We also have a YouTube channel. So today we're going to talk about the fifth stage of development as formulated by Erik Erikson. And this stage is identity versus, some people call it role confusion. Some people call it identity versus identity diffusion or confusion. But basically, it's forming an identity versus the inability to do that. And this is during adolescence, when teens are from approximately 13 to 18, but it can go longer than that. It can be till 13 to 20 and even the early 20s, when a person is really basically figuring out who he or she is. So Harry, let's discuss what occurs during this time frame from a neuroscience perspective.
So we're entering at this stage another very dramatic period of brain rewiring and wiring. Hormonal influences create sort of what I would call reopening of the wiring system of the brain, and all the topics that we talked about before, which is reinforcement of certain pathways and pruning of other pathways, takes place at a very, very rapid pace. Particularly,
you could explain pruning again.
Theoretically and practically, anatomically, we're born with a lot of wiring. So in the white matter, there's really kind of excessive amount of wiring between different neurons. And as we live through our lives early on, the experiences that matter, that are survival important, that are emotionally important, create reinforcements in the wiring and the networks between neuron A and neuron B, and other irrelevant or less relevant wiring components of the brain are pruned, meaning you can literally think of it as shears that go in and cut off the connections, because without that pruning, brain is inefficient and there is too much information that shuttles around, and it becomes very difficult to select survival, emotionally important aspects of person's experience. And in fact, some of the theories of autism spectrum disorder are based on the notion that inadequate pruning takes place, so that there is too much information available and the person gets overwhelmed with too much light, too much talking, too much noise, too much sensory information, and eventually causes a specific kind of anxiety that I call body anxiety versus the social anxiety as we think in normal terms of anxiety.
You watch a hyperactive child or young person, there's too much going on.
Yes, exactly. It's very hard to distinguish, I should be paying attention to this versus I should not be paying attention to that, because everything is the same relevance. So during this period, the process of development of identity is very heavily driven by social experience. So in the pre-social media times, our social exposure was fairly limited to our immediate network of friends and family, and also to some extent television of what we were seeing, and maybe magazines that we were reading. So in the 70s, 80s, 90s, kids would put pictures of their favorite artists on the wall and would maybe use the same haircut. And in the process of developing their identity and sense of self.
Right.
Well, with the screens, I would postulate it got much more complicated because the plethora of versions of sense of self that people are able to project that both include real selves, but also fantasied selves that are designed and created and projected based on their wishes on how to project themselves. All of that is available to kids.
Because of social media
Yes.
primarily, right? It can be just like so and so.
Exactly. And from that perspective, what is fascinating to sort of stop and think about, brain does not have very rapid critical thought built in. It will a priori accept input as something that's a given. So if they see the projection on the screen, they will take it as real unless they go into the second process of wondering about it, questioning it, what we would call critical thinking.
Right.
And with social media, there's very little critical thinking. So there's a lot of consumption of data and surface identification.
That makes a lot of sense. Why so many people are taken in by so and so, because if it's just going through this non-critical thinking stage, just where the input is taken into the brain, that makes a lot of sense.
And interestingly, experientially, clinically, because in my clinical practice, I see hundreds of children and young adults exactly in this period through my work with Embark Behavioral Health. I see hundreds of children that did not find their own tribe, so to speak, in the physical world of school, or have family issues or otherwise feeling different. And they truly get lost in the world of social media. I would go as far as to say that in my career, which is now about 20 years of practice, I have seen an explosion of youngsters in this age that identify as transgender, and there are various flavors of how they are, from my perspective, they're really trying to find their identity, their tribe, and the challenges are extraordinary. Again, given the complexity of the world that they're entering. So the language that Erickson uses to describe this stage of development is so spot on as a challenge for our kids to develop a sense of who they are, and then as young adults, who are they going to be as adults?
I'd just like to add that another thing that happens is that they aren't exposed to real life experiences that are so important, like meeting each other at, I mean, they might still get together, but it's a whole different thing to meet somebody at a fast food restaurant and, see who has what car and what so and so is wearing, than just to observe all this on some screen.
Another interesting phenomena, since you're mentioning real life experience, that gets to be really, really challenged, nearly impossible in the social media, especially the way kids use it now, is the idea of ghosting or blocking somebody.
Yeah.
One of the essential aspects of being able to function as an adult is the ability to tolerate aggression, experience your own aggression, and deal with aggression in the social context. And not having that skill and having a tool that says, I disagree with you, or I don't like what you said, and being able to click and just shut down the conversation does not really promote those kind of social skills that are required in the 20s to build a career, create a family, and all of the other social goals.
Because people in their 20s were exposed to social media pretty early. I guess it was, I don't know, was it 2012, 2013, something like that when it started? People in their late 20s, I mean, it's nothing for them to block so-and-so because they said X, Y, or Z, or they said something to your boyfriend or whatever. So
it's very difficult to develop a skill of mentalizing how the other person feels. It creates a certain kind of distance that can lead to cruelty because, again, brain doesn't experience some of these relationships as real. So when a teenager commits suicide because somebody else has bullied them online, the bully themselves likely don't really perceive that what they're doing is very, very real. And it's a space in which the other person is experiencing it as a very, very real attack. So the lack of sort of social echo chamber in the real world and lack of real consequences can lead to some really catastrophic consequences. I mean, I have thousands of stories that I could share from now a massive clinical experience of working with teenagers. And in fact, I'll take a moment to say that that work was actually an inspiration for the book that you and I are working on, Karen, because it is so disturbing to practice in the world where I saw youngsters before the social media, at the dawn of social media, and now that social media truly, we can say, are the cause of the brain rot of our teenagers and young adults.
Yeah, no, that's really important. So let's talk about mitigating the problem. What can we do? What can parents and other caregivers, teachers, what can they do to strike a balance? Because obviously, well, there is a movement, I guess, to ban phones, i.e. social media in school. I don't know where that will go, but apart from that, what can people do? Parents, as I said, what can they do to encourage real life experiences and to limit screen time without having without a huge fight or having their teenagers have meltdowns and attacks because they can't use their phones?
This is a conversation I have with parents of every new kid that comes into the program. From about
Sure.
6 to 10 times a week, it's the same conversation. And the answer is pretty standardized canned response. And it is very simple and it's based on neuroscience. And what is interesting is that kids are willing to hear it when it's explained from the neuroscience perspective.
Yeah.
Two phenomena of spending time on screen that are particularly damaging to a child is a loss of sense of time. There's an organic sense of time that brain has to develop and a feeling of what an hour is and what 10 minutes is and what a day is. And it's a very organic phenomena that is analog in nature. And when kids spend a lot of time on screen, they both spend time that is not marked, or most of our clocks these days are digital. So they don't give you an organic sense of time because numbers simply change. So first piece of advice is to install analog, old-fashioned ARM phones everywhere where child is, in the bedroom, in the living room, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, so we all know what time of the day it is. And then we all agree in non-conflictual way, the screens will be available between thus and such a time until thus and such a time. For social media, because that's their lifeline, and these days we simply cannot take it away from the kids, my rule of thumb is to give them the screens in the presence of the family, so in the living room, not in the privacy of their bedroom, between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m., after they return from school, before the family dinner, time to catch up with friends and put it away. However, in order to get that time with screens, they have to perform 3 chores of mutual agreements with families. I usually recommend helping with cooking or doing the dishes or cleaning the floors or cleaning their room, whatever is appropriate for a particular family. The reason being is that actual physical activity is creative process. And there's an immediate feeling of accomplishment when dishes are washed or the room is clean. And it is remarkable to see a sense of pride when a 17-year-old tells me that they cleaned their room and it looks really nice. And their face is shining because they took that time to clean their room and they feel different. So those are very simple agreement on time, what the schedule looks like, when is bedtime, when do screens go off. It is literally reestablishing control over structure of the day. And because kids get in trouble if they use screens in their own personal space, including sending nude pictures of themselves, including receiving nude pictures from their friends, including taking videos, they can't do any of that in the context of the living room with their families. So that's a brief answer, Karen.
Sure. So I think we also want to encourage in-person activities.
Yes.
With their friends, get-togethers. Of course, kids today all have, or many of them have, up one side and down the other. Swimming lessons, they play instruments, they do all kinds of things. Cheerleading, this and that. But just social activities are important too. Just get-togethers with friends versus getting together with friends online.
Yeah. It's effortful in our world, but it's worth the effort to get kids together to watch movies together, as
Right.
opposed to shared watching on Netflix where everybody's sitting in their own bedroom,
Yeah.
staring at the screen.
What about family movies? Do you suggest that? I've suggested that some.
So the rest of the day would be a family dinner and then a family movie. And as I may have mentioned in the previous podcast, there's only so many times I can see Pirates of the Caribbean, but I do watch Pirates of the Caribbean on repeat, or a cartoon, or there are movies that we can all watch. The benefit of that is you can see your child's brain develop as their tastes in movies change. And you're also present to interpret the reality. So even in teenage years, children will need us to help them understand the news, the violence, the sexuality, the things that they don't know what to do with. They need their parents to be there to help them interpret the world.
Well, I have to say, with my granddaughter, I moved up from Paw Patrol to Dora. Or I think maybe I've gone back and forth, but I don't know what the next show will be. But we're into Dora now, so
Congratulations! It's easier to digest than
really,
steady diet of Paw Patrol.
how about? I think another thing that's very important from a psychological perspective, a common sense perspective, and a neurological one, is the effects of too much screen time on sleep.
Mhm.
What it does to sleep, because we need to sleep.
One thing that children, teenagers, young adults will really respond to is explanation that they cannot feel well the next day if they stayed up until 2 or 3 a.m. And to explain the hormonal diurnal cycles and tell them about cortisol levels that get disrupted, and to point out the feeling of feeling yucky and low and slow the next day, they really can understand that. And for kids that really egregiously stay up until 3 or 4 a.m., I usually start making small agreements, which is 1 a.m. being the drop dead deadline to go to sleep, that they shut everything down at 1 a.m. And then we slowly move it backwards to the time that is appropriate for them and appropriate for their school schedule. But organizing them around really understanding why it is important, not because an adult said so, but from the perspective of them tolerating frustration the next day, being well mood regulated the next day, being able to remember things because they all want to do better at school. So some neuroscience brain explanation really go a long way for kids to understand. One of the things that they will also respond to is educating them that playing a video game is a really exhausting task for the brain. There is tracking of various input of information, there is reacting, there is choice making. It is absolutely exhausting. And while it feels pleasurable and entertaining, the cost is that the brain is used up by the end of 2 hours of playing games. they will hear that and understand that when I ask them to limit it because they want to do well at school, that's the reason I'm asking them, not because I'm an old fogey that doesn't like computer games, which is also true. I'm an old fogey that doesn't like computer games.
Well, what about this situation? So I have this person who is in her early 30s. And I think that she really got into video games with a boyfriend several years ago. And it really is or is like an addiction. She stays up playing these games. What we've come to realize is that she's lonely. She doesn't want to be alone. I mean, she misses this person, but she misses company. In college, of course, she had roommates. She's having a hard time tolerating being alone, living alone. So I think it can be a substitute, and it feels very much like an addiction.
It's very addictive, and that's why kids throw tantrums and have meltdowns when you take it away. It's like, taking a heroin syringe from a heroin addict that's full of heroin, and you're trying to take it away. And without sort of the cognitive framework of why we're taking it away, then it's a war, it's a battle. All of the games these days are social games where people are engaged with other people. Therefore, it gives them a quasi-social experience of friendship, which is not real. And alternatively, the addiction is created by internal algorithms that give people a sense of mastery. So people that are anxious about their real lives and afraid of succeeding, and this is very true for all of the young adults that end up in my care, they don't quite know how to function as young adults, but they're really, really good at Fortnite or Minecraft. And the levels inside give them a sense of accomplishment, and they are number 2 or number 3 or number 1. And it is a very toxic magic world that is not a real world, but the feedback loop of popularity and success that exists within a computer game can hijack a decade. I started seeing a young man who was 30, and he's lost his entire second decade of life in a computer game.
Let's talk about long-term implications of brain development if there's reduced sleep for long periods of time. Just say somebody is addicted to video games or whatever they're doing with their screens, and they don't sleep for it just they get into a pattern of not sleeping. I know that their cognitive function is, that's one thing that's problematic, but.
So I think if we look at the purpose of the sleep, it's and I'd like to hear your thoughts from psychoanalytic perspective, from neuroscience perspective, it's a period of rest and consolidation of the day's experience. So it's a time when the brain sort of processes what happened and how it happened, and consolidation of memories in many ways we think has a lot to do with the process of sleeping. So when we're interfering with that, we're interfering with the process of creating long-term memories. So the life sort of is flying by, so to speak, in this endless loop of stimulation without any time for contemplation. To add to that concept, I drove both of my kids crazy when they would say, "I am bored." My response was always, "That's great." And they would look at me like I'm crazy. I said, the boredom is the space where creativity is born. It's the space where we can think about our internal world and come up with ideas and plans and thoughts about the future. They don't buy it 100% of the time, but it's fun to have this conversation with them. So the chronic lack of sleep certainly affects memory, affects affect regulation the next day. The beautiful thing with early intervention and working with teens and young adults is brain rewires. So if they develop healthy habits, things get better. But the sooner you grab it, the sooner you're able to establish structure, the better they do, really.
Yeah, it reminds me of the saying, neurons that fire together, wire together.
Exactly. That's the pruning concept.
Yeah. So that's really obviously important. I think one of the major things from a psychoanalytic perspective goes back to the this phase of development. You can't form an identity if you're really sleep deprived over long periods of time because you've been on social media all night. You can't do the things that you need to do. You can't engage with friends. You can't do the activities that are so important. You can't explore the world in whatever ways that you do that personally if you're just online all the time. So that gets into identity diffusion or role confusion, like who am I? You learn how to navigate in the world with other people by being with other people. And I think it's easy to fall into just having social media friends when real friends are what's needed. I had a young person one time, teenager, and he was very proud of all the friends that he had on social media. And when I would, ask him, try to be supportive as possible, but ask him, well, tell me about these friends. What do you know about them? And he got really very sad when he realized he didn't really know anything about them. You could say you're the king of wherever or the queen of wherever, but that doesn't have a lot to do with being authentic. So I think inauthenticity, if there's such a word, exists a lot.
Speaking of inauthenticity, I think the corollary thought I had just as you were talking is the screens are also the world of reaction. We're just reacting to what the screen is giving us. There's no demand on what we do in analytic therapy all the time, which is asking the question, why am I reacting this way? Or why am I doing this? So I didn't think I was going to talk about this, but one of the symptoms that kids oftentimes present into treatment with is impulsivity. And even they can't stop themselves. So they will do things that they're remorseful about, stealing a credit card from parents and buying something, running out and having sex with the boy next door. And it's the world in which the impulse and controller are disconnected. And then installing the question, like, should I be doing this? Why am I doing this? Just understanding how your brain operates is a function that's really severely impacted by the screens. And back to the identity, the notion of sort of carbon copying other people's identity versus in real life being exposed to other identities and slowly adapting or rejecting aspects of other people. As kids enter echo chambers, then everybody is in a particular space and they all look alike and feel alike, and because they can also cancel and exclude everybody else.
Absolutely. You're right on the money with that. Well, I think that there are takeaways from our podcast today. I was on a train to New Jersey, and this was in January of 2024, and I was going with my daughter to a funeral. And I remember the first time that I was on the same line going to New Jersey with my mother when I was 5 years old. I was happily romping around, talking with people. I'd love to go to the dining car. And of course, this is a long time ago, but the world felt like a safe place then. And I think one could form an identity. I think it was much easier then. There's so many pressures and so many things you're supposed to be if you follow people on social media. So it's definitely a different world. But America is a different place. I mean, crime is obviously rampant. There have been so many school shootings. There's so many, without getting into a political discussion, there's such a political divide, and neighbors don't speak to each other anymore. And I think a lot of this has to do with lost identity. Who are we as people, and who are we as Americans? What do we stand for? Is truth important? Do we care about our fellow citizens, or is it just a dog-eat-dog world? And what happened to our sense of community? So I think a loss of identity or one that was never formed has so many implications for these questions. So I'll let you talk about the wrap up for the neuroscience perspective.
Well, I think everything you said are the functions that are supported by the brain. And I think the concept that I would like to introduce is our concept of reality. What is real and what isn't. It's really a complex internal brain function detecting what's reality. Like when we touch and smell something, we can identify it. When we start talking about concepts, then it's really the social agreement that creates a sense of reality. Then this is real and the other thing is not. What are we? Who are we? Is defined by the group itself. And
Yeah.
as we have expanded our groups by being members of social media that have millions of people there, but we have also shrunk our groups because there are tiny little rooms where we can hide with 6 other people and create our own reality. So that a crime that happens to 5 people begins to resonate if it's happening to 5 million people. The other phenomena that I think is also really, really important, and I started to teach this phenomena years ago before social media, is the concept of overexposure to data, to information. Brain can only tolerate so much information about danger and tragedy because we're empathic creatures. We react to war in Ukraine as if it's happening down the street from us, even though it isn't. And before such massive exposure to data, we were blissfully unaware. We are in many ways, for racial or other reasons, blissfully unaware of all of the violence in Africa, but it's there. It's happening all the time. The tenor and the amount of, I would say, the floods of data about the precarious state of the world is very demoralizing to teenagers and young children. We have young adults that are despairing over the state of the world, choosing not to have children because of concepts such as climate change and political upheavals. And it is a really good question to ask. What are we accomplishing? What is positive about the flood of information we're exposed to? What is negative about the flood of information? But again, how do we impart on our kids to be wise consumers of information, and how do they begin to understand what is their domain of influence? And in many ways, to educate a 17-year-old that they may not be able to save the planet on a Tuesday, but they may be able to get out of bed, go to school, date a girl, clean their room, and go to bed and feel good the next day within their own little space, is kind of an interesting process, and they will sometimes respond to that. I would like to end by saying that this is a very critical stage of development, and if we can do anything, we need to participate in sharing the experience of the world that we had, which was before the screens and before the social media, and teach kids that when they run a search in Google and Google AI gives them the first response that they see, that response may be wrong, and they may need to use their brain to find out more.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And I think just to add to it, or I think to blend together this statement with what you just said, if identity isn't formed during this period, it's precarious. It's a precarious situation. It's not that one can't form it later, but it's much more difficult.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Harry. And thank everybody for listening, and we will be back with episode 4 very soon.